Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. Today we're going to visit the remains of a formidable Roman town that was lost in the 3rd century CE and not rediscovered until the 1920s. Things always change, but the fact that such an important Roman town, one with all the benefits of Roman civil life except status as a colonia, could be found, captured, settled, developed into an important trading area close to the main Roman superhighway through what is now southern France, and then completely disappear is astonishing. This painting by Vincent van Gogh was executed during his stay at Saint Paul Masoule, a mental institution across the street from what had once been the main entrance to this thriving town. And it shows you what the area looked like in 1889. Not just forgotten, but covered over with olive trees. Let's take a look today with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Welcome to the Glanum Archaeological Park. The northern entrance to the Roman city today is less than half a mile south and an easy walk on a pretty day of modern Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, which we'll visit in a future tour. Glanum had existed as a distinct Celtic Ligurian settlement since at least the 5th or 6th century BCE, and was a going concern long before the legionaries arrived. It was built on a rise in the Alpilles range, and it developed along a narrow valley, with its structures adapted to the sloping terrain. The rugged terrain nearby would have made it much easier to defend, if necessary, compared with the significantly lower and much larger tableland of the nearest other settlement, where Saint-Rémy stands today. Notice the highway, now called D5, that leads almost directly south from today's Saint-Rémy, past Glanum, and all the way to Les Baux-de-Provence. Making allowances for having to cross streams and climb some pretty steep hills, this is actually a pretty straight road. I've discovered that other major French roads run on top of or quite close to the route of the Roman roads. Roman engineers were excellent at surveying and scouting locations. They were also expert at building roads. Roadbeds might be 6 feet or more deep, filled with layers of compacted fill, and topped, for the most important routes, approximately 50,000 miles worth at the height of the empire and stretching all the way to Byzantium with hard pavers. Here in Provence, those pavers would have been made out of limestone carved locally. The roads only disappeared when enterprising people dug them up. Was this a Roman road? Possibly. I can't say for sure whether this was a Roman road, but perhaps it was a spur of the Via Domitia running northward to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. You may have read that Homer's Troy was actually a series of at least 7 cities, each built on top of the rubble of its predecessor. Glanum is much the same way. Long before any outsiders arrived, Glanum was a Celtic Ligurian settlement centered around a sacred spring dedicated to a Gaulish deity called Glanus. The locals, called the Salians, were the largest Celto-Ligurian tribe in Provence. They picked a nice defensible hill, built a rampart of stones on the peaks, and constructed an oppidum, or fortified town, around a spring in the valley. The spring was actually known for its healing powers, but it was also a year-round water source. These men and women built the first Glanum, constructed on this small plateau. The first known visitors to the area were Greek traders, probably foraging out of the Greek port of Massalia, today's Marseille. Some of the earliest construction, still identifiable, shows traces of Greek construction and style. I don't believe the Greeks actually colonized the area, but the Salian encounter with them in the Mediterranean world meant that their style is still perceptible on the site today. This could be called the second Glanum. Archaeologists believe, exploration is ongoing, that underneath, for example, the ruins now identified as a Roman-era forum, sits the remains of a Greek-style agora, and even a Greek temple. Not much remains from the days when Greek culture dominated the area, except perhaps for some very large-cut blocks here at the spring. They were carefully cut and fit together, but generally larger than those favored by the Romans. Glanum was important, but it wasn't primarily a military outpost. The city played a key role in Roman expansion of their empire in the area and was a strategic and cultural hub. It was valuable for controlling trade and movement. After its conquest, Glanum became a key center for spreading Roman culture, language, and architecture in the region. The town adopted Roman urban planning with baths, a forum, and a triumphal arch, reflecting its integration into the empire. At its peak, Glanum likely had a population of around 6,000 inhabitants during the 1st century BCE through the end of the 1st century CE, when it was a thriving town. The excavated area of Glanum, which we'll visit today, covers about 62 acres or so, which is relatively small compared to major Roman cities. This model was designed for model building enthusiasts and is the closest I could find to show you what the northern section of the Roman city would have looked like. At the right, you can see a monumental entryway and a mausoleum, which will be our first stop. The location of this arch and what has always been called a mausoleum have confused the issue of the exact size of Glanum for generations. Roman custom was to build their burial places, called necropolises, outside of the city walls. We saw a good example of this back in Arles. Military Rome put up strong walls with guarded and closable gateways. The co-location of these two architectural gems makes no sense until you realize that the arch is purely symbolic and not defensive in nature. It probably did sit at the main entryway to the city from the north, but if there was ever a wall here, no one has ever discovered any signs of it. Glanum was a prosperous town, and while not as big as the Roman colony in Arles or Orange, by the 2nd century AD it was wealthy enough to build all the usual infrastructure and more. Visitors would have entered the city through this glorious monumental archway, sited next to now what is believed to be a memorial shrine. Visitors following the Via Domitia, which ran slightly north of Glanum, would have entered the city through this monumental arch, designed, built, and meant to display, impress, and celebrate Roman control of the area. The triumphal arch stood probably just outside the northern gate of the city, next to the mausoleum, and was a visible symbol of Roman power and authority. It was built near the end of the reign of Augustus Caesar, who died in 14 AD. In antiquity, this likely stood alone, not connected to a wall, despite a legend that this was some kind of defensive gateway. If there was any way to hang gates on this building, I was never able to find them, nor have any of the archaeologists who have studied it intensively for decades. Glanum certainly had some defensive walls, but this was not part of it. Perhaps when this was built, the Romans didn't think they were necessary. The designers and builders took advantage of the excellent limestone from a nearby quarry. The memorial has a single central archway, as opposed to the three-arched triumphal arches found in some larger Roman cities. It was decorated with relief carvings on the side that show Roman military victories and submission of the Gauls. The figures, including captives in traditional barbarian attire, including long pants and long hair, were propaganda, showcasing Roman military superiority. The archway once had an attic or upper section, but that has been lost over time. The mausoleum of the Julii sits next to the monumental arch. Its existence and dedication are a bit puzzling and require some explanation. In 27 BCE, the Emperor Augustus created a Roman province here called Gallia Narbonensis, and in this province, Glanum was given the title of Oppidum Latinum, which gave the residents a civil and political status of citizens of Rome. To the citizens of the city, this was enormously important. It meant that they had arrived on the imperial stage and were no longer simply an occupied people. They belonged. This is a rare example of Roman funerary architecture and is one of the best preserved mausoleums from this period in all of France. Its style and detailed carvings reflect both Roman and Gallic influences, showcasing the process of Romanization of the region. There is more than one theory about why it was built and who it honors. The inscription on the base has been deciphered to read Sextius Marcus and Lucius Julius, sons of Gaius, to their forebears. Henri Roland, one of the archaeologists who rediscovered the site here in the 1920s, thought it might be dedicated to the memory of Gaius and Lucius Caesar, grandsons of the Emperor Augustus. A second, and possibly more plausible and certainly more touching theory, is that the mausoleum was actually the tomb of a mother and father of 3 Julii brothers, and that the father, for military or civil service, had received Roman citizenship and the privilege of bearing the name of the Julii, one of the most distinguished families in Rome. This would have been a much bigger deal than the blanket citizenship derived just by becoming an oppidum Latin. The mausoleum theory actually goes along with the fact that the structure was clearly set outside of what we'd call the city limits, as was the Roman practice at the time. No matter how achieved, citizenship was an important fact to the lives of the Romanized Gauls, and a status that could be passed down to their children. So honoring the man who would have gotten it was appropriate, although based on the size of this thing, the family must have been quite wealthy as well. The people who did have Roman citizenship were proud of the fact and would have celebrated whoever earned the status for the family. The Romans chose to build a city here in part for the same reason as did the Salians, the presence of a reliable year-round water source. This well and the algae-covered pool next to it were the immediate source of water for the Celtic oppidum. 2 millennia later, there still is water, although these days I think it's mostly rainwater runoff. When I came upon this building, my printed map told me it was something called the House of the Ante, but didn't explain what that meant. I jumped to the conclusion that it might have been named after one of the old owners, but I was wrong. The house was built in the style of Greek houses all over the Mediterranean, surrounding a peristyle. Peristyle comes from the words peri, meaning around, and style, which means column. So a peristyle was a place with columns all the way around it. The walkway and columns were usually made out of limestone and would have been made out of limestone here. Richer people might be able to afford marble. The earliest peristyle courtyards that we know of were in Greek houses built to provide some shade and relief to the inhabitants during hot weather. People could work in the shade of the columns and have good natural light from the courtyard or a garden in the middle. This was such a handy form that it continued long after the Greeks and then after the Romans exited the world stage. In the Middle Ages in Europe, the peristyle courtyards developed into cloisters in monasteries and convents. We sometimes see them to this day, perhaps as part of a shopping center. The peristyle here included a small pool fed by rainwater from the roof, which channeled the water into a cistern for domestic use, although probably not for direct consumption, and after that into the drains which ran under the pavement of the street. So where did that name actually come from? It turns out it was named after 2 fluted antae that flanked the doorway of the building itself. The antae were supporting posts or pillars built into the end of a weight-bearing wall on either side of a main doorway. This image, with the antae outlined in red, comes from Wikipedia and shows you what the face of the building might have looked like in its prime. This area has been identified as part of the thermal baths, which came complete with a fountain. Civilized Roman life always included public baths, even 500 miles as the crow flies, and much further by road and foot from downtown Rome. The northern part of Glanum was at the bottom of a kind of a slope and was a residential quarter. This was the site of villas and insulae and extensive public baths. The baths were a center of social life and also helped to Romanize the local population. The baths were built around 75 BCE. Later on, during the reign of Lucius Verus in the late 2nd century CE, they were rebuilt and the building was covered over with marble. Water fed into a pool through the mouth of a stone theatrical mask. The original is now in a museum, but this reproduction sits in the original position. The sacred well was a starting point for Roman occupiers and later citizens of the town that grew up here, but it wasn't nearly enough to supply the volume of water required for things like public baths and fountains. The Romans built a dam and created a reservoir. The Glanum Dam was a curved stone-arched dam and is the oldest known of its kind. They also built an aqueduct here in the 1st century BCE to supply water to the town's fountains and baths. The dam sat in the hills south of Glanum. The water collected in what is now called Lake Piru and fed through an aqueduct that led to Glanum. The remains of the Roman dam were destroyed during construction of a modern replacement in 1891, but the newer dam and reservoir or lake are still there and clearly visible. Unfortunately, it doesn't always fill with water, as you can see from this Google Earth image taken in 2018. My site map of the archaeological area identified this as a temple to Apollo, but more recent scholarship tells us they were probably dedicated to the imperial cult, almost certainly to Lucius and Gaius, the adoptive sons of the Emperor Augustus. These twin temples were an important and unusual feature in the First Forum. Although we can only see a couple of columns today, there were actually 2 temples set one next to the other, one a bit larger than the other. The 2 temples were enclosed on 3 sides by a kind of arcade. The columns did not survive antiquity. What you see here has been restored. The smaller temple has been partially reconstructed using the original pieces as models. These views, taken from the hill above the site, give you some idea of just how impressive this area must have been. Roman roads, the important ones, especially in downtown areas, were paved with stone, and this one probably survives because the entire area was abandoned and eventually covered up with silt. This photograph shows you a tourist, just like me, walking along a Roman road paved with stone. The road probably survived not because people weren't interested in digging up the stones, but the stones were very large and were eventually covered up by silt and forgotten. The area you see immediately to the left of our tourist was almost certainly part of the drainage system for the city. Stormwater and sewage drains ran near and sometimes under the roads, and they were important because this city was built on a flat spot in the middle of a ravine. At the beginning of our walk, I mentioned that Glanum had 3 distinct periods of development. And there's more than one story about how it ended, since they were quite different. Sometime in the 2nd century BCE, the town was captured from the Celtic natives by Roman legionaries, who dug up much of the then existing Greek-style architecture and put in their own buildings. Things went well. The Romans put in a highway. This was a stopper mansione on it. Nearby, they actually put in a dam, formed a lake, and added an aqueduct to channel plentiful fresh water to the city. Roman builders also put in a forum, baths, and temples, including one dedicated to the adoptive grandsons of the Emperor Augustus. Gradually, however, Roman power in the area faded. Around 270 CE, the city was destroyed and gradually abandoned following the first wave of Germanic invasions. The survivors moved further north and began to build the present-day town of Saint-Rémy de Provence. To do this, they recycled some of the stone already cut and in use in Glanum. Gradually, the survivors and then their children forgot all about the abandoned town. Glanum ended up by being completely buried under a thick layer of dirt nearly 8 meters high. This is probably one reason why it survived as well as it did. Only the monumental arch and the mausoleum that we saw at the beginning of our visit remained visible. Gradually, the entire site was repurposed as farmland and olive groves. It was one of those groves that Van Gogh spotted from his time at the mental asylum just across the street. In the summer of 1921, the first systematic excavations began. The work of these men established Glanum as a recognized archaeological site, and they opened it to the public, making it one of the most significant Roman sites today, although, from my experience, far less visited than nearby Saint-Rémy. Research and study is ongoing. This is being carried out by INRAP, the National Institute for Archaeological Research, in cooperation with the Center of National Monuments. They're looking to assess the site's condition and to document potential new discoveries. Among other things, they're looking for structures and trying to map them so nothing currently hidden, either under dirt or later buildings, is damaged by the new excavations. They have new tools. They don't just dig trenches anymore. They use ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scanning, and soil analysis to see what's there before they start digging. This represents an enormous improvement over earlier methods. You probably guessed that I had a lot of fun exploring the archaeological park, and when I go back someday, I expect a great deal more will have been discovered and possibly uncovered and documented from the ongoing archaeological research. At the end of my walk, however, I was facing another walk along the highway and back to Saint-Rémy, and then a bus from there back to Avignon. I knew for sure I needed a pit stop before marching northward. I was hot, dusty, and tired, and definitely ready for some refreshment, which I found in the form of a small cafe overlooking the site. Its principal draw, I admit, was lunch and the promise of a bathroom, but there was far more. When I visited, and if you believe Google Maps, even today, this is the only watering hole between Glanum and Saint-Rémy. The folks here had a monopoly, but weren't much interested in price gouging and seemed quite friendly. I ordered whatever the special was, I think a slab of roast beef and some mashed potatoes, and there was a pitcher of rosé wine. I know that the area is famous for making rosé wines. The food tasted just fine. The rosé was something local, so it came in a pitcher and I didn't think to photograph the menu, but it was cold. I checked on Google Maps and was pleasantly surprised to find that the place is still in business, at least during the summer season, and most visitors seem to understand its limitations. And despite its limitations, most visitors really liked it. There are always a few grumps posting reviews in places like Google Maps, including one griper who complained because, and I quote, "no one speaking good English," end quote. Sheesh! It's in the middle of the south of France on the edge of one of the lesser visited sites in the region, but we can safely ignore them, and I am. For now, however, it's time for us to call it a day. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France, not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on the ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up, other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog, a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.